A couple of days ago, I witnessed this here for the first time and phoned my wife that evening and said, in the face of the brilliance and the creativity that I've seen here, I feel very inadequate. And she said to me, "So what are you going to do?" And I said, "I will plead geriatrics." And she said, "But there are some quite brilliant geriatrics." So I said, "Well, then I'll just have to tell the truth, and that is that I'm a plodder. I'm not really very creative." And I propose tonight, this afternoon, to tell you a little about some of the work that I've done. I've strung together a lot of portraits. They don't necessarily relate to each other, but in my head there is a sort of thread running through, and I hope it won't be too disjointed. This is the escort, the commando that brought Dr. Verwoerd into the 50th anniversary celebrations of the National Party in 1964, And a lot of the photographs I'm going to talk about have what we in Afrikaans is called an ingewikkelde quality, a kind of involuted complexity. The man in the middle there, these were all policemen, incidentally, and these were police horses lent by the government to the occasion. And the man in the middle is Leon Wessels, who became a Deputy Minister of Justice in the National Party cabinet and was the first senior nationalist to apologize for apartheid and is today a human rights lawyer. So the obvious is not necessarily the obvious. This man, Kurt Cordier, sits with great delicacy. Those of you who know the photography of Dorothea Lange will remember something of hers in this picture. Farmers tend to sit like this. I'm not sure why. This was in De Hel, the Gamkes Kloof, in the remote area of the Gamkes Kloof. And the unique thing about this farming community was that many of the people there that I met did not know the word kaffer, the K word. Quite extraordinary in South Africa at that time, in the 1960s. And this is Stephen Leroux, who wrote obscure novels, one of which was banned by the government, and farmed a huge sheep farm around in the Koffiefontein area of the Free State. In the 1960s, I photographed the gold mines of the Witwatersrand, which were dying, and I began to photograph mining men as well, and requested permission from the Anglo-American Corporation to visit one of their big compounds or hostels. I was given permission to go to Western Deep Levels, which was a very big mine, and when I arrived, to my shock, I found that the compound manager had instructed every tribal group in the compound. These were, for those of you from overseas, the compounds were big enclosures in which perhaps 8,000 men, migrant laborers, single men in that instance, were enclosed. And he had instructed every tribal group to present themselves to me in tribal attire. I was about to pack up my things and go back home. I didn't want to make ethnographic photographs, when I saw that the men actually took this very seriously and that they presented themselves with great dignity to me. So I did a number of photographs, and this is one of them, young Pondo miners. The highest rank to which a black man could rise in the gold mining industry, or the mining industry in South Africa then, was the boss boy, which came to be called more politely the team leader. And this was on Randfontein Estates, where in the town that I was born in. And he displays the whole paraphernalia of his rank. And that photograph became one which will link up to others that I'll show you a little later. This was Margaret Msingana, who became known as Margaret Singana, a famous singer. She was then on the chorus line. And the photograph was taken as an attempt at an essay on Soweto. This was the early 1970s. I had suggested to the editor of Optima magazine of the Anglo-American Corporation that they do an essay on Soweto. At that time, this vast complex of townships was hardly known to South Africans, in particular to white South Africans. And he agreed, and I suggested that Peter Magubane, a colleague of mine, should be the photographer. Unfortunately, Peter went into solitary confinement and then a period of banishment, and it became clear that he would not be able to do it, so it was suggested that I do it. A friend, Sipho Sepamela, a black writer and poet, took me into Soweto, and he introduced me to Margaret Msingana. And this was the first photograph that I did there, and it became for me a kind of icon of the township, because the township was a very strange place, Soweto. It was not a slum. People think that it was a slum. It was not a slum. It was a vast series of government-built houses. And these houses were designed, specifically designed, to prevent people from, or to discourage people from putting down roots. They wanted people who lived there to be laborers in the so-called white economy and to go back home to their tribal homelands, which most of them didn't know. And so that wall, that hellish wall, was for me a kind of symbol of the claustrophobic tightness of that place. This was in the Soweto essay. These young men were at a coal yard, and I asked if I could take a photograph of them. And without hesitation, this one pulled out his dompas. The dompas was the document that every African person over the age of 16 had to carry at all times with him or her, on pain of arrest without it. And what I'd like you to look at is the delicacy with which he holds it. He could have held it out to me as a white man and said, "Fuck you," and shown me his dompas. But he held it delicately. There was a deep irony in his gesture. These gestures came to mean a lot to me. And this is a photograph that came from the cup final, the soccer cup final at the Soweto Stadium. And forgive me for analyzing the structure of my photographs. I'm sorry. But it pivots around that. The whole photograph pivots around that. There's a mass of testosterone there. And Soweto at that time was a place in which jack rollers, young men, would drive around in motor cars, pull a girl off the street, and then rape her. And for me, this photograph came to symbolize that almost palpable violence that I felt in the place sometimes on weekends. This lady and her child were in deep depression. She had just been divorced unexpectedly by her husband. This was in Hillbrow. I did a lot of photographs there. And the physicality, the physicalness of people impressed me deeply, and their limbs, and the way they held themselves. This was a one-eyed house painter in Hillbrow, and there he is with his family. And I found it extraordinary that without any hesitation, the child mimicked his father. And I loved the strength of those limbs and the delicacy of these. So I began then in 1975 on a series of photographs that became obsessional for about 6 months. I was obsessed by the parts of people's bodies, largely as a result of the awareness that I had developed during the taking of those photographs. And this young lady was sitting with others on a on a bench in Fordsburg, a suburb of Johannesburg, and I was greatly attracted to her. And I approached, and the others took off like a flock of birds, but she remained sitting there. And I said to her, "You have beautiful hands. May I photograph them?" I didn't disclose that there were other parts of the anatomy that attracted me greatly. And she said, 20 cents, by which I understood that she was a sex worker. And I said, "No, I really don't want to pay you. I love your hands. They're very beautiful. May I photograph you?" And she said, "No, 20 cents. So I said, "Then don't worry," and I walked away. And as I walked away, she called me back, and she said, "All right, you can do it." And so I then did a photograph. And for me, that fold of flesh is almost iconic and symbolic of womanhood. And she said to me, "Come, let's go to Swaziland for the weekend." And now Swaziland was a place to which white men went because over the border they would be able to liaise with black women. We then had the Immorality Act, which forbade sex across the color line. And I said, "Thank you really very much, but it was your hands that I was most interested in." And she said, "Oh, such a nice man." And this one, a friend called Free State Balls. And I took these photographs originally thinking when I began them that it would be, for once, something lyrical that I could do. It would be an expression of my own sensuality, sexuality, my interest in people, and so on. But inevitably, without ever meaning it to or looking for it, it also had political overtones. This one comes from Boksburg, a town on the East Rand, very similar to the one that I was brought up in on the West Rand. And this young lady was told, instructed by her mother, to show me her new tutu. And for me, she was perhaps the apotheosis of the young white woman trapped in the rigidities of white middle-class life at that time. This is Wendy Orr, who was a young doctor. She was in her first job. She was 23 years old, and she'd been posted to Port Elizabeth, where she worked in the district surgeon's department. And she became aware of torture being done in that prison by the security police. This was a time of the emergency, states of emergency in South Africa, the mid-1980s. And with huge courage, it took immense courage, she then liaised with some lawyers and took affidavits from these prisoners, and then went to court and showed unequivocally what was happening in our prison, in that prison, and it didn't take much to deduce it, in many other prisons throughout the country. And it led to a complete overturning of the system of detention. Her bosses, who were the doctors that supervised Steve Biko, and who were later removed from the professional registry, were of course outraged by what she did. And at that time, many people were being tortured by the security police and maltreated. A number of us photographers would take photographs of the evidence of what was being done. We made ourselves available to lawyers. They would call on us to photograph somebody's back who had been shamboked, whipped, and so on. And I, in addition to that, wanted to photograph people who had been in detention and been tortured by the police. So I made myself known to the, it was called the Detainees Parents Support Committee. At that time, it was not permissible, if my son was detained, for me to tell you that he was detained. I could try to render assistance to him in the way of bringing him food parcels and so on, but the police tried to control the information, secrecy. Secrecy was of the utmost importance to them. So the Detainees Parents Support Committee was set up by, obviously by parents, and became a very active anti-apartheid thorn in the side of the government. And so they would occasionally phone me and say that they had somebody who was prepared to be photographed. I found eventually that there were very few people who were prepared to be photographed because they feared the security police and that there would be a comeback. Anyway, this young man, Lawrence Maichi, 15 years old, came from what was then the northern Transvaal, where he'd been involved in an incident of stone throwing. And the security police came that night or that morning at 2 or 3 in the morning, hauled him out of bed. He didn't have a chance to get dressed properly. They dragged him out by his feet. And as he was being dragged out, his hands were above his head. And one of the policemen kicked his hands, each one of them, so that the hand went into the forearm. He was detained for 6 days and given no medical assistance whatever. His friends, colleagues in prison with him, pulled his hands out of his arms. And I met him in Johannesburg at the Detainees Parents Support Committee offices in Kotze House, which was later blown up by the security police, just after he'd seen an orthopedic surgeon. To my shame and regret, I don't know what happened to him. But I have to say, I felt in him a kind of compassion. There was no hate. And that was our president, Prime Minister and then President P.W. Botha, at the Union Buildings in Pretoria. I don't usually show my personal work with my professional work, but there are a few photographs here that I took professionally. I did a lot of work for magazines, in particular a magazine called Leadership. And we did quite a lot of political interviews. And I developed a sort of technique for doing this because one was put in a situation where you didn't have a lot of time and you had to be master of the situation, otherwise you couldn't get a good photograph. And that meant, in this case, and in the case of Robert Mugabe in Harare, and in the case of the president of Mozambique at the time, arguing with the press officers and quite often with their security police. In this case, there was very little light in the president's office in the Union Buildings, but I knew that if I opened the curtains, I would get the light that I wanted. And the security policeman was very loath to allow me to open the curtain because they feared bullets. But eventually, my request was granted, and so I got the photograph. And that's Albie Sachs, who became a judge in our constitutional court shortly after he returned from exile. He was severely injured in a letter bomb, sent to him by the security police. He lost an eye, an arm, and was badly hurt. and that was one of the men who did it. That's Craig Williamson, who was a master spy, assassin, and security policeman. He inveigled himself into the student movement at the time, which was obviously strongly anti-apartheid, and eventually got himself posted to Geneva, where he penetrated to the highest levels of the international student movement. So he was privy to all kinds of secure information, or supposedly secure information about students and the movement of funds and anti-apartheid organizations. He was eventually unmasked and came back to South Africa. He was still a security policeman when I photographed him. I had obviously to get permission from his handler, General van der Merwe. He is suspected strongly, but it was never shown, that he assassinated or had something to do with the assassination of the Swedish Prime Minister Palme. And that's Constant Viljoen, who was the head of our army. He had it within his power to put us into a state of civil war. At the time when the consultations were going on between the ANC, the National Party, and we had numerous crises in the country, he actually had an army standing by, an army of men standing by, ready to go into action. And he realized that if he gave the order, we would have a civil war of untold bloodiness in South Africa. And he retracted. And this photograph was taken at a very large right-wing gathering in Pretoria. You can see them, people ranked way up there. It was in a big hall in Pretoria. And he had just told his followers, the right wing, that he was not prepared, to take South Africa into a civil war. And they called him, as they called General Smuts at the end of the Anglo-Boer War, a verraaier, a traitor. They were very angry with him. And that's his wife, who was in tears. I don't know who that lady was. I would love to know. And that, I need hardly tell you, is Madiba. This was a photograph taken not long before he became the first president of the new Democratic Republic of South Africa. I was with two journalists, and we went to his home in Houghton in Johannesburg at 5 o'clock in the morning. He was doing his exercises. His press secretary, Karel Niehaus, showed me around and said, well, perhaps you'll want to do Mr. Mandela in that chair. And I saw what I call a goma chair. It's one of those deep armchairs into which you sink. And if you want to destroy a politician, that's one of the best ways of doing him, because he becomes all knees. And I said, no, I don't want to do Mr. Mandela in that chair. I want a straight-back kitchen chair, please. And he said, you cannot possibly photograph Mr. Mandela on a straight-back kitchen chair. And I said, well, I've come to photograph Mr. Mandela and not the furniture, and I want a straight-back kitchen chair. And most unwillingly, he eventually got me exactly what I wanted, and I got the photograph that I had hoped to get, and he eventually apologized to me. And I have to say that I had that argument with the press secretary of President Kenneth Kaunda in Lusaka, and Mugabe in Harare. They want to protect their heroes and put them into what they regard as being the best furniture. And the man in Mozambique, whose name I can't recall now. In doing all of this portraiture, I formed the idea that I would like to take up on those particulars photographs by going a stage further and doing nudes. I didn't want to do nudes as nudes. I wasn't, after doing some beautiful bodies, I wanted to do photographs of people as I found them. Those were all found photographs, those particulars. I wanted somehow to find people in the nude. But of course, one doesn't find people in the nude, generally speaking. And so I thought about this and didn't get anywhere. And then I formed the idea of perhaps photographing experienced bodies. Bodies that had seen life, women who had given birth, men who'd been perhaps in action or wounded or whatever. And so I spoke to a friend whose wife then, now his ex-wife, catered to the needs of the movie industry and supplied extras to the movie industry. And she said she would find me some experienced bodies. And so she introduced me to a lady of about my age. And this lady agreed to pose for me, to be a subject. And one day I went to her flat very near here in Sea Point, and she was dressed in a robe, and she took it off for me, and then she said, "No groping." And I said, no groping. And I took some photographs, and I wasn't feeling very good about them. They didn't seem to be working. And then she said, "You know, I'd like to wear a hat." And I said, "Okay, have you got any hats?" And she said, "Yes, I've got lots of hats upstairs." And so we then started walking up the stairs. And then I found myself walking behind a bum that I'd never seen before, and thought the photographer's life is really a very interesting one. And we selected a hat, came downstairs, and did some photographs. And I just knew that there was nothing. It was not working. So anyway, I sort of tucked away the idea for a time. And then I had a letter from Antjie Kroch, a friend and a writer. And Antjie said that she's doing poems about sexuality in older people. And did I know any photographers or photographs of that? And I said I didn't really. There was an Italian photographer who I know had done some work on that, but that I was very interested in doing this. And so we agreed to collaborate. And we were going, in fact, to go away for perhaps a weekend with somebody who was prepared to model both for her and for me. But it never happened. And then Antjie wrote to me one day and she said, "I've written the poems now and I'd really like you to do a cover photograph for it. And I've asked a friend of mine who's, I think she was in her 70s or thereabout, and she would pose for you." And so I then did that for Antjie. And it interested me greatly because I found this extraordinary quality of the obviously aged arm and hand, and yet the youthfulness of the breasts. And that tension, for me, was what made the photograph really interesting. Antjie used the cover on that book of poems, and she told me that in the English edition, it sold out very quickly. In the Afrikaans edition, it tended not to sell out it didn't sell out, and that managers in the bookstores had told her that if somebody saw the book in Afrikaans, they quickly turned it over. And so I then did a number of photographs. This is of a friend who'd been through a traumatic love affair. This is Deborah Poynton, the painter. She and I struck a deal. I would pose for her in the nude if she would pose, and she will pose for me in the nude. And this is her in her studio at that time. she'd been doing that painting, and that was a portrait of a colleague, Guy Tillum. Since then, I've done other photographs of her, one of which was this week, in fact, in which she was clothed. And this is somebody who was on the stage yesterday, Zanele Mkholi, a friend and colleague, with her then partner. I've not really pursued that line of development. It's one that I'd like to take up again. We have a very high crime rate in South Africa, as you probably know, and there are very few of us in urban areas who have not been touched by crime, often violently. I didn't want, and I felt that I wanted somehow to come closer to this phenomenon. I didn't want to go out with the cops. Other photographers have done that, done it very well, and it was not the sort of thing that I wanted to do. I didn't want to go into prisons particularly. I wanted to meet people who had been in trouble with the law as ordinary people, as I might meet you, as I might meet somebody on the street or in a supermarket. And so I set about looking for subjects, people who had been in trouble with the law. And I developed an approach, largely through organizations dealing with ex-offenders or people in prison. I've made contact, and I approach somebody who's probably been in prison and tell them that I'm very curious. I'm doing this really because I'm curious. I'm not doing it because I think I can reform anything or change anything. I'm not doing this to sensationalize crime. I'm not doing this because I want to sensationalize your story. But I would like to go back to the scene of the crime with you, and I would like then for you to tell me the story of your life. And recognizing that this would often be a very painful thing for people to do, I offer to pay. I don't work for anybody. I don't work for a newspaper or a magazine. I'm not bound by some sort of journalistic code where one doesn't normally pay for stories. I simply was curious. I am. And so I've done a number of portraits of this kind. The subject signs a release for me, allowing me to exhibit and talk about the photographs and the interviews. And I, in turn, have made a public undertaking that I will not make money out of this work. So after paying gallery commissions, if there's a gallery involved, I give the money, the balance, to organizations dealing with offenders. So this is Bongani Satori. He came from quite a well-to-do farming family in KwaZulu-Natal. They had cattle and a good homestead, and he got into trouble with his parents because he preferred to herd the cattle. He didn't like going to school. Then his father died, and he had to take care of the cattle and the family. And then they had floods, and the homestead was destroyed and cattle washed away, and they fell on very bad times. And eventually he went to try and get work in the mines, and from there he couldn't get work. And then one day he said to himself, he's got to do something about this, and he was very handy with his hands, and so he became a gun maker. He made shotguns, folding up shotguns for people who were in crime, and sold them. And then he decided one day to use one for himself, and he had noticed that there was a farm road near a town that he knew, where a farmer would after having collected the money from the bank for wages, the farmer would drive along that road, and there was a certain bump where he thought he would be able to hold up the farmer and take the money. And he did this. He hid in this plantation and waited for the farmer, and the farmer came along, and Bongani jumped out, held up the farmer ran away, he got the money, but he was caught and he went to prison. I think he was in prison for 8 years, and I went back with him here. And in his case, he had been helped by an organization called Phoenix, which works with offenders, and he had passed his heavy-duty driver's license, and he was looking for work as a truck driver. And this is a story of two ladies, one of whom got into trouble with the law, not because she committed a crime, but because she didn't commit a crime. They were partners, lesbians, and this is in Soweto, in Johannesburg, and they had visited the sister of Nomsa. This is Bridget, this is Nomsa. And they had visited Nomsa's sister, who had a room in the backyard of this house. And they spent a Saturday afternoon there, they drank some beer and chatted. And one of the other tenants of the rooms in the backyard was a young man who asked Bridget why she didn't have sex with men. And Bridget just explained, well, she prefers women. And this young man said, well, he implied you need a man. And that night they went to bed. Nomsa and Bridget shared a bed with Nomsa's sister. And during the night, Bridget felt her panties being pulled down. And she sort of nudged her partner and said, don't be silly, not now, not here. And then she discovered that this young man had somehow got into the room and was attempting to assert what we call in South Africa corrective rape. There was a hell of a fight then. She beat the man with she found an iron rod. Nomsa was stabbed. And all hell broke loose. The next morning, Bridget was called to the police station, expecting that the young man had perhaps laid a charge against her. But that wasn't the case. The lady of the house had complained to the police that Bridget had stolen her television set, which was clearly not the case and impossible. Anyway, Bridget, to keep things quiet, agreed to pay her off and a certain amount every month. And then a short while later, perhaps a week or two later, Bridget and Nomsa went to a party in Pretoria, and when they came back, there was a message for Bridget to report to the police station again, which she did. And she discovered that the lady of the house had laid a charge of armed robbery against her. She claimed that Bridget had stolen money from her and laid a charge against her. Bridget was taken to court. She had legal aid, a lawyer from the Legal Aid Bureau, a government organization. The investigating officer was drunk. He had done no investigating whatever, and he was in cahoots with the defense lawyer, who didn't call a single witness. Bridget was sent to jail. She was sentenced to 10 years. During her imprisonment, she discovered that there was a group running that was teaching the law. and she attended. And she then wrote an appeal and submitted it to the Supreme Court and was eventually called to court, and the 3 judges spent 10 minutes looking at her case and said she has no case to answer, and she was freed. So she spent three years in prison for a crime that she didn't commit. I strongly sympathize with Zanelli, my activist friend and almost daughter. There is a tremendous amount of homophobia in the legal system and and particularly in the townships, something that we've got to deal with in South Africa. And this is the last picture. It's not what I would call a conventional portrait. My fond name for it is Willem Boshoff's Granite Turd. Willem Boshoff is one of our great artists, and he sculpted this piece of granite which sits on the campus of the University of the Free State in Bloemfontein. And how it got there is as follows. A couple of years ago, there was an incident at the university in which some young Afrikaner men pissed into the food of some black workers. The incident created a huge furor. I think the girlfriend of one of these men had videoed it on her cell phone, and it went viral. The university dealt with the young men. I think they were all dismissed, although one of them today acts as a marketing manager for the university. But the university then went into what I consider to be an enormously imaginative idea and scheme. Instead of closing in and putting up barriers and fences and creating impossible rules, they invested in a major, they made a major investment in art. They commissioned major pieces of new art for the campus. These things were to dot the campus. The idea being that the campus would then be a place in which people would be exposed to other ways of being and other ideas. And that's how this came to be. Willem's name for it, and actually it is a beautiful name, is the Thinking Stone. And I did this photograph just last Saturday on my way here. And I consider it to be a thinking stone in the sense that it challenges us to think about where we are here in this country and what kind of people we are. So it is, to me, an almost ultimate portrait. Thank you very much.